as always. Welcome back to another session. I'm your session leader, Lionel, and this one we're going to talk about the macronutrients. So if you watch my intro video, then you know that I had discussed going over like the kcal and AMDRs and things like that, which is acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. Those videos are going to be coming, a little bit after I talk about macronutrients, because it's important that you understand what macronutrients are and how they work and whatnot in your intake. So once you understand what they are, their different responsibilities in our bodies, then you'll be able to understand and sort of, allow everything to come full circle once I get to the kcal and the AMDR videos. But for right now, this is session 101A, so I've titled it. And we're going to talk about our first macronutrient, which is known as carbohydrates. So the other two macronutrients, because there's three, the other two are fats and proteins. If you're like me and coming up in school, science maybe wasn't your best subject, well then this channel is definitely for you when it comes to nutrition and fitness, because I've sort of found a way to break things down in a way that people can understand it without all the scientific terms and things like that. So what we have here, I've kind of split this into two sides of the board. And we're going to, of course, focus on this side first, because this is the sort of chemist's view. That's what they call it in, in nutrition. But this is sort of the chemist's view of, how carbohydrates are made up and what they consist of. We're going to start here with this first bullet point. Carbohydrates, as you can see, are made of carbons, hydrogen, and oxygens. Those are the atoms that are found in carbohydrates. And believe it or not, they're also found in the other two, fats and proteins. The difference with protein though, and I'll of course get to that in that video, but just a little preview. So with proteins has the added atom of nitrogen. So it'll be carbons, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in protein. So that's the only difference with protein. But carbs and fats, and proteins of course too, they all have these same three, atoms. So when you look at carbohydrates, this is what carbohydrates typically are made of. So carbo is C. It's something that I learned when I was in the my undergrad program for that nutrition and wellness certificate that I recently earned. But carbo, that's the C in carbohydrates. And then the hydrate is the H2O. So basically carbohydrates comprises mostly of carbons and water. Carbohydrates, something that some of y'all may not know, because you may hear a lot of times, you want to avoid sugars and things like that if you want to, lose weight and whatnot. And that is actually partially true, just not all the way. There's always context and nuance that goes into these things. So with that said, carbohydrates consist of these three things: sugars, starches, and fibers. Now, what we're going to see here is we got monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So those are the different types of sugars that make up carbohydrates, right? So monosaccharides, now mono means one, right? For those of you that, may need a little bit of a refresher on certain suffix and prefix words. Well, mono is one, di is two, and then poly is many. So what this basically boils down to is monosaccharides are made up of single sugars, right? Just one. And these are your single sugars. These are the different types of monosaccharides that are found within carbohydrates. You have glucose, which is the main one. And even though it's on that side of the board, I'll go ahead and touch on glucose right here, because glucose is actually the body's main source of energy. It uses carbs specifically to go ahead and convert over to glucose and provide energy. So with that follows galactose, which doesn't really occur in mass amounts. That occurs in small amounts. You don't really have to worry so much about galactose like that, at least not until you get to the disaccharides. But the last monosaccharide is fructose. If you look at the prefix word fructose occurs naturally in fruits. So of course, any type of fruit you can think of, your apples, cherries, strawberries, blueberries, pineapples, any type of, all your favorite fruits. That's what essentially fructose occurs naturally in, okay? Now, then we move into the disaccharides. Now, mind you, again, two. So disaccharides is made up of two sugars, okay? They're two units of sugars chained together. So the first one we have here on the board is maltose. Now, maltose is made up of two glucose units, okay? Sucrose is a combination of glucose and fructose. Now, one thing I forgot to say about maltose also occurs in fermentation of alcohol. Now there's sucrose, which is glucose and fructose combo. Now because of the fructose combo, because of the fructose half of this, sort of chain, sucrose, it occurs naturally in fruits, right? And some veggies as well. And it also occurs in some of your refined sugars and, some certain items that are enhanced with your artificial sweeteners and flavoring. And then you have lactose, which is one that probably most of you already know about, or at least, know where you can get lactose from. Lactose is a combination of glucose and galactose. And lactose, of course, occurs naturally in milk products. Now, if you'll notice, in all these disaccharides, the common denominator is glucose. So remember when I said earlier, glucose is the body's main source of energy. That's really what your body needs in order to do, certain physical activities and things like that, things of that nature. But glucose is the main common denominator. Glucose is in every one of these combinations. Now you have polysaccharides, which is poly is many. So these are many different sugars chained together. Now you have glycogen, starches, and fibers. Now glycogen, which I'm also going to touch on, it's on that side of the board as well. But glycogen, what essentially happens there, I'll just go ahead and touch on that now, I might as well. But glucose, what happens is when you intake carbohydrate-rich foods, your body will take glucose from those carbs and it will use glucose, it'll use a portion of that glucose immediately, right? Whatever's left over gets put in glycogen stores. What happens is glycogen, right, it gets stored in your body for later use. So as I have over here, the marathon runner and the sprinter, those are examples of, when your body might use glycogen, right? It might use the later stores because a marathon runner, right? So as I said, your glucose is the body's main source of energy. But if you're a marathon runner or maybe a sprinter, those are moderate to high intense activities, right? Meaning, you may run out of the glucose that was made for immediate use. But because you're still running, right, you're still engaged in activity of some sort, and that is activity of moderate to higher intensity, you still may need some more glucose. So where does it go? Well, it's going to go to that glycogen store. And what happens is, once, your signals and whatnot from the brain and nerve cells and all that, once, a signal is sent, through hormones and whatnot, your glycogen store will then break apart. It'll produce loads of glucose. So then once that happens, you're able to continue running that marathon or continue doing sprints, until of course you're done and you go have your next meal where you replace a little bit of those carbs. Then you have starches and fibers left. Starches essentially occur in foods like rice, wheat, barley, bread, pasta. Those are all starches. And now fibers, okay, there are, from what I remember, 3 different types of fibers. So some of y'all know what fiber is and what it does for you already, but maybe some of y'all don't know that there are different types of fibers. And what I have here are soluble fibers, insoluble, and then dietary fibers. So what a soluble fiber is those are the foods that dissolve in water. They enter your body, and once you eat soluble fiber type foods, it enters your body will then go to work in releasing some of the liquid, some of the fluid that's in your body that allows your, food to go ahead and start extracting the nutrients out of it. And that's what happens here. And because they dissolve in water, it slows digestion down a little bit. Because of course, as it goes through that process, right, the soluble fiber foods, they're going through your system and, they're actually being digested, right? Which is where the insoluble fiber is going to differ. Soluble fiber is said to be good for heart health and to, reduce risks of cancer. Something to keep in mind. Insoluble fiber, you get that out of foods such as, your whole wheats, your whole grains, fruits, veggies, and of course, legumes. So that would be your beans, black beans, pinto beans, lentils, even edamame, right? Different types of beans. The opposite end is the insoluble fiber. So what differs the soluble and insoluble is that the insoluble, of course, does not dissolve in water. Now, I remember my mother telling me this when I was a kid, and it's a good example to use, to describe insoluble fibers. But an example of insoluble fiber might be like corn. and maybe some of y'all have heard this too, but I was told at a young age that when you eat corn, it doesn't actually digest. I was told that corn goes right through you. So that's what insoluble fiber foods are. And it promotes quicker digestion because what happens is as that food goes through you, it starts adding bulk to your stool, which then, promotes faster passing of said stool. And because of that, that's what researchers find, that insoluble fiber is good for GI health or gastrointestinal, basically your gut. Then we have dietary fiber. Now, this is the type of fiber that simply passes through your digestive system for breakdown, but it doesn't actually get broken down in the digestive tract by enzymes. It gets broken down by bacteria in your colon. And because of that, dietary fiber produces little to no energy. There's no glucose really to come out of it. There's no monosaccharides to come out of it because of how it's digested. But it's still recommended that you get dietary fiber. Down here I have what's called DRI. Dietary recommended intake of dietary fiber is about 25 grams per day for women and about 38 grams of fiber per day for men. Now, with that said, we then go over to carbohydrates' bodily responsibilities. Since now we're done with the science of how carbohydrates operate and what it all consists of, you basically now know that, when it comes to sugar, right, carbohydrates are comprised of sugars. Carbohydrates, that's what you need, in order to get your body some energy. So as I mentioned already, glucose is the body's main source of energy. So that's what happens when you eat carbohydrate-rich foods. Your body then takes those carbs, converts it over to glucose, and then uses that glucose for different things, right? Whether it be you doing physical activity, a weightlifting session, or you doing marathon running, sprinting, whatever, any kind of workout. But the thing about glucose that maybe people don't know is that it's not just used as a source of energy for you to conduct physical activity and your daily activities. Glucose is also used for your liver and your muscle cells and even your nerve cells. Your body in general, in order to function and to keep, maintenance of your cells that's in your body, it uses glucose. Even your body needs energy to do, its own internal duties. So I thought that was pretty cool to learn. Moderate to high intensity activity. So basically what that's about is that's what glucose is meant for the most. What I found when I was in my certificate program, and something I didn't know myself as long as I've been working out, was that when you do moderate to high intensity activity, your body prefers carbs. It prefers glucose. Whereas if you're doing, something that's not as moderate, you're doing like really light intensity, something that's very low in intensity, then your body's gonna prefer to use triglycerides, which is a type of fat. So essentially, your body's gonna want to prefer fat for the less intense things. But anything moderate to high intensity, your body uses glucose for that, because that's what glucose essentially is really designed for. Now we're gonna get into what happens when you don't get enough carbs. Well, as you can imagine, that's absolutely a problem. So two things can happen out of you not getting enough carbs. You have a process called gluconeogenesis and then a process called ketosis. Or ketosis is not so much a process, but it's more like a state that your body will enter if you don't get enough carbs in. So what gluconeogenesis is it's basically your body, because it doesn't have the glucose that it needs because you're not intaking enough carbs, then what happens is, your body needs energy from somewhere. It prefers glucose for most things, most internal activities and even for external activities, working out, weightlifting, doing cardio, things like that. Your body prefers glucose, okay? So because of that, your body will start a process called gluconeogenesis if absolutely necessary. Because the problem is with fat, even though that is considered an energy source, it doesn't produce glucose in high amounts, or at least at the same rate that carbohydrates does. So what will happen is gluconeogenesis, your body will then call upon proteins to literally make a new glucose. Like it'll sacrifice the proteins in your body to make a new glucose. And that is really not something you want, because proteins itself, they already have a responsibility and duty to your body. They already have other activities, other, burdens and duties and whatnot within your body and your cells and stuff like that. it's already got its own job. So you don't really want your body, sacrificing proteins to make a new glucose just so that you can get some energy. You don't really want that. Because, the last thing you want, your body starts breaking down protein, and I'll talk about that in the protein video too. But, that'll be 101C, I believe. So anyway, your body will start breaking down proteins, right? And then, it'll start breaking down like what is literally the building blocks of proteins, which is amino acids. And that's what you need in order to like build and maintain muscle and even repair, replace, and maintain cells. So you definitely want to make sure you get your carbs in. Now that brings me down to ketosis. So ketosis is a state your body can enter if you don't get enough carbs. What I want to speak on is a specific dieting type, and that's the keto diet. Now, mind you, I would never tell anybody not to do the keto diet. The keto diet, it has its benefits. It really does work. The premise around the keto diet is low carbs and high fat, right? It's essentially a low carb and high fat diet. It's supposed to be a way for you to, get more fat in, right? So that your body uses fats for energy, which, like I said, fat is an energy source. It's not as great as carbs, but it is absolutely an energy source. Now, while the keto diet does work, you want to be careful that you're maintaining the premise that it's supposed to just be a low carb diet and not a no carb diet. If you don't get any carbs in at all, your body can enter a state of ketosis. And what that does is, because you're not getting any carbs in, your body is essentially utilizing fatty acids, right? It's going to use fats, ketone bodies, which is essentially fat bodies. And they're going to, because they're in abundance, right? Because there's so much in your body from you not getting in carbs, those ketone bodies are then going to chain together, and you're going to disturb your body's acid-base balance, right? Because ketone bodies are very acidic in the bloodstream. So you don't want your body entering a state of ketosis and then throwing off your acid-base balance, right? Because again, that's how proteins also come into play. Proteins, they essentially serve as a way to make sure that, everything is sort of transferring and transitioning to and from where they need to go in your body. But when proteins are being sacrificed, and then you got ketosis in the mix, right? You got acid, going like just sort of just imbalance in your body. Everything is sort of unequal. Well, that's what can happen. All right, so you don't want any of that. So you want to make sure, researchers say that you want to make sure you get between 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrates a day if you're on the keto diet. Or even if you're not on the keto diet, you still want to make sure you get between 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrates. In the video that I'm going to make where I talk about kcalories, which is the energy measurement for how much of your energy, how much proteins, fats, and carbs should come from your caloric intake, it's all going to make sense now. Why it is that you want to make sure you sort of, I don't want to say track, but you want to make sure you are being mindful of, the amount of carbs, fats, and proteins you're putting in your body as it relates to your goals. It corresponds or correlates with your gender, your age, and your lifestyle. That's what happens when you don't get enough carbs in. So now we look to overconsumption. So what happens when you overconsume carbs? So the general rule is, especially with macronutrients, the general rule is that anything in excess that does not get used essentially gets turned into fat. So you may sit there and question, for example, like why it is that there are some vegans, that was like probably the best example I can use. You may question why it is that there are some vegans that actually have a little bit of weight on them. There's some vegans out there that are heavy, right? And you think, well, they don't eat meat, or they don't eat they're plant-based, so why is it that they're so, well, the reason why is because they may not, most likely, I don't want to say that's the reason why, but one of the reasons that could be why they're a little heavier as a vegan is because, they may not be tracking exactly what it is they're putting into their body as it relates to the macronutrients. Anything in excess gets turned usually into fat, and it gets stored in your adipose tissue, which is your fat tissue. What you then have is, that's what happens when it comes to overconsumption. Your liver will take any excess glucose and it'll convert it to fat, and then it'll store it. in your body. So that's why you want to be mindful of how much carbs you are getting. I mean, you want to, anything insufficient is bad, and anything that you in excess, when you overconsume, that's bad too. Because see, the thing about overconsumption, right? However much you are taking in, your activity level has to be at a level, right, that allows you to be able to use the glucose, the carbs that are being consumed. Otherwise, you have all this extra, and then like going back to the glycogen stores, right? Even though when you intake carbohydrate-rich foods and everything goes in the glycogen stores, well, whatever's left over, I should say. So as I said earlier, your body will use glucose immediately and then put whatever's left over in glycogen stores to be stored for later use. Well, here's the thing about that later use. Most people's bodies, in general, glycogen stores only last about a day or so, right? They only last about a day, maybe a day and a half. You may get 2 days depending on, the body, depending on your genetics and things like that. If you don't use any of that, okay, if the glycogen is just sitting there, your body can't hold it for like a day or so. So like if after a day or a day and a half or what have you, you still got these glycogen stores in you and you're not doing any activity to, break open the glycogen stores to produce glucose for whatever your body needs, then that extra glucose gets converted over to fat. Some stuff that you definitely want to be mindful of as you look at the macronutrients, especially carbohydrates, and you begin to understand what the body does with them, and so that makes you a little bit more mindful as to how much to actually take. And again, stick around. I'll definitely, not in this video, but maybe a couple videos after I'm done discussing the macronutrients, because the next video is going to be fats, and then the video after that will be proteins, and then once the macronutrients are done, then I'll go into kcals, where I'll actually be doing some math on this board, because that is actually going to require some math, right? You'll see why when I do that video. But I couldn't get to the kcal video just yet, and I know that I said that was going to be my next one, but it wouldn't make sense for me to go over that if I didn't cover the macronutrients first. Since kcal and the AMDR, or the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, relate to the macronutrients. So this is kind of like sort of a foundations, type deal where, you got to understand the basics first before we start getting into the math and the weeds of things. But this is basically how carbohydrates are, right? This is your carbohydrate video. Now we're going to go ahead and do a little recap. We talked about how carbs is the main energy source for the body, right? Your body typically, in most cases, prefers carbs. It may pull on fats. It shouldn't really ever pull on proteins. If it does, then your intake is a little off, or something's going on to where you're not. And there's different factors for that too. It's not always you're not doing things right. It could be genetics. You could have a certain maybe autoimmune disease where so with your cells or what have you, that is affecting your balance of your macros. But for the most part, if you're a healthy individual, or somewhat healthy, it's important to know your intake as it relates to your activity level, age, gender, and current lifestyle. Shoot, you even use energy when you sleep. Like your body uses calories when you sleep, or even when you're at rest after a workout. Stuff like that. So your body essentially is almost always in a state where it needs energy. So that's why carbs are important. Number 2, here we say don't overindulge on the sugars that are refined or enhanced with artificial flavors or sweeteners. So just make sure you can. I'll never tell you not to have them at all, or just cut them out. If you want to, cool. But I say cut back a lot. Like, so on your sugars that are refined, because you have carbohydrates are made up of sugars anyway. But if you ever look and you see on the nutrition facts, you'll see a certain amount of sugars, and then underneath it you'll see added sugars. Though you want to make sure you limit how much of those type of items you're consuming, for the simple fact that this is what can happen to you. The sugars, even the refined and added sugars, the stuff that you get from like granulated sugar, like when you go to the grocery store, you got a bag of granulated sugar. When you use that type of sugar, or when you eat things like your sweets, cakes, stuff like that, when you eat all of that, in excess, right? When you eat it in abundance, again, anything that doesn't get used gets converted over to fat stores. So even if you're not really eating fat foods, like fattening foods, I should say, eating carbs in excess amounts will pretty much, still take care of that for you. Like it'll still, essentially, you could lead to obesity, and then of course obesity, leads you to different, cancers and heart disease, stuff like that. And then underneath the sweeteners, right, that goes into the liver's operation. The liver, has a fat clearing pathway and a fat making pathway. So obviously, the pathway you want to have the liver, utilize the most is the fat clearing. But your liver's fat clearing pathway, it can't really work that well if you're overindulging on like refined sugars and things that are enhanced with sweeteners and artificial flavoring. It's actually going to promote your liver's fat making pathway. It's said that those types of sugars should be about 5% of your daily caloric intake. That's pretty much it though. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned some things. Maybe these were things you already knew, or maybe, something that I went over here, you didn't really know. Maybe you didn't really quite know how carbohydrates, function in the terms of the chemist or in scientific terms, broken down. But this is pretty much it. Stick with me through the next 2 macronutrient sessions. At the end of each video, like the one on my intro video, I'll always post like whatever meal, whatever the entree is. Of course, there'll be vegetables, maybe some rice or what have you in it. But, I'll always try to post what the entree is of that meal prep that I put at the end of the video. So you get to see what types of foods I eat. That next video, which is gonna be fats, that's gonna be very near and dear to me because, I deal with that personally. So, it resonates with me. But again, that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching. You got any questions, comments, concerns, please hit my comment section. I check through them periodically. Hit the like and the subscribe button if what I provide is of value to you. And appreciate you again. I hope y'all have a marvelous rest of your day, and I'll see y'all on the next one.